What I will do now is much broader in scope. It's much more reflecting my personal ideas as a scholar, but also as a private individual who works with Oriental heritage. Having discussed this with members of the board, we decided that I would do it in a sort of intuitive way. So I will just give you my train of thoughts that I had when we discussed the goals of Oriental heritage without borders, and what my own individual feelings are about that. So what I will give to you today will be an enormously variegated picture of various impressions that I have with connections that I make between those connections. And I expect, and in a way I hope, that after a little bit more than an hour, all of you will be terribly confused, because that's always the best outcome that you can have at a lecture. So I'll start with this image. And I do this more often. I also give this image when I do an introductory course for my students in Amsterdam, the introductory course of ancient history in general. And I ask them, what is this? And well, I won't play that game with you, but you can guess that when I ask it like that, the answer cannot be a horse. And indeed, this is not a horse, or this is not just a horse. This is culture, what you see here. This is one of the most strongest symbols of culture. And why? Not only because the horse was domesticated by man very early on in history, but also because the horse, as you see it here, which is a horse of race, with a certain height, with a certain musculature, with a certain shape that makes it perfect for riding, that is a product of centuries and centuries of crossbreeding. And there is a continuity in this over the centuries and over the cultures, over the continents, where you can trace back this crossbreeding, this enhancing of the stature of the horse, all the way back to the first domestication of the horse. And this is not a linear development. You can imagine that in the history there have been terrible battles, there has been terrible suffering by man in those battles, but also by animals. Think of the Napoleonic Wars, think of the horrible expedition of Napoleon against Russia, where thousands and thousands of horses died, tens of thousands died. And that made horses, on the average, smaller in Europe, because there were not enough race horses of race, that could provide for the continuity of horses of that certain quality. So what you see here really is a reflection of us, of Oriental and Occidental, of Near Eastern and European history, and tied together. You cannot see the horse in Europe separately from the horse in the ancient Near East or the modern Near East. So, and this is just an example, of course, just as the example of the Napoleonic Wars is just an example, because there are other wars in which man and animals suffer terribly. This is the so-called Alexander mosaic from about 100 BCA, and it's a representation of one of the big battles between Alexander, the Macedonian conqueror of the Near East, and Darius III, the last king of the Persian Empire. And it's, of course, it's a bridge that I make in my talk to connect the horse with this, because obviously a lot of horses suffered here. But it is also actually in the sources, in the biographies of Alexander the Great. Page after page you read that they had a problem with having sufficient horses, because they died all the time on the way. Also because Alexander initially didn't use camels, and he was traversing regions where camels were much more suitable than horses, so his horses died massively. So here too you would expect to have an impact on horses in the world. But of course I show this also for a different reason, because of the two protagonists in this picture, in this famous picture in the Museum of Naples. On the left, Alexander, and on the right, Darius. And they are, of course, juxtaposed in this picture, emphatically by the artist. By the way, the mosaic is not an original work of art, it's an ancient copy of a mural painting, maybe in Hellenistic Egypt, and probably made not long after Alexander died. So it is from the period of Alexander, actually. So, Alexander, the young conqueror, and Darius opposite him. An image that everybody will read as a confrontation between the West and the East. Everybody will see it in this, and the artist quite clearly focused on these two leaders in the battle to represent them symbolically as the leaders of the East and the West. And you can also see different attitudes that he wanted to represent. Alexander is the young, vigorous conqueror who goes with his spear like this. You know, he has no sign of fear. And at least on first sight, Darius seems to be panicking, and his chariot is turning. He's leaving the battlefield, which is also in the Greek sources. He's leaving the battlefield under the enormous pressure of the Macedonian, of the Greek attack. Now there is something really strange in what I'm saying, because nobody of you protested when I said that we all read this as a confrontation between East and West. But of course this is very strange that we are all so conditioned that we can read it like that. That is not a natural thing. That is not a natural thing. Macedonia and Alexander is not the West, and Darius is not the East. But we are conditioned to read it like this. And as I said, I'm sure that the artist meant it like that. And after this, there is an enormous afterlife of this particular picture and of interpretations of it, and they all take it as a highly successful, symbolic rendering of that ancient conflict between East and West. When it was discovered, for instance, Goethe's son was present at the discovery. He wrote about that as the best representation of this ancient fight. So it's really interesting that we see it like that. And of course, you know probably many images. I just show you a few. This is Albrecht Altdorfer, to be seen in Munich in the Alte Pinakothek, and it also represents one of the battles between Alexander and Darius. In the vast panorama, it's a very big painting on wood. It has beautiful colors. It is enormously detailed. Here are the two protagonists again. Darius on the left, fleeing, and Alexander, again young and vigorous, here represented as a medieval knight, and he's chasing Darius. But Altdorfer went even further, and that's why I show this picture. And now I'll show you the weather conditions behind this scene on the painting. And as you see, the sun is rising behind the Macedonian troops on the right, and the moon is darkened on the left behind the Persian troops. And this is very interesting because this really is a reversal of Orient and Occident, of East and West. Because Orient, obviously, is from the Latin, and it means the land of the rising sun, by the rising literally, right? And Occident is where the sun sets, Europe is where the sun sets. And he reverses that. The sun that is coming up, henceforth is what Altdorfer is saying, henceforth is our symbol. And because he is speaking as us in this painting, he is saying, henceforth the darkened moon will be the symbol of the East. Which is of course very clever, because in his time, you know, with the Ottoman threat in Eastern Europe and the half moon being the symbol of that, he could work that into his painting. So there is a contemporary allusion, of course, in this painting. So what is this, the Orient and the Occident? I'm actually very happy about this map of South America that we have here, because it will show my point quite easily. If you think of America, or you think of Australia, we have no trouble in understanding each other, because everybody knows that America is surrounded on all sides by seas, just as Australia. Australia is basically a very big island. So nobody would make a mistake about what Australia is. But with the Orient and Europe, it's much more difficult. There is no continuity in the demarcation of the Orient, and basically everybody has his own definition of it. So let's go into the history of this. This is where apparently the border is. This is the Galata Bridge in, no sorry, it's not the Galata Bridge of course, this is the big Bosphorus Bridge in Istanbul. And it crosses the Bosphorus that divides Istanbul in an Asian and a European part. But who has defined this city as a split city? Who has come up with the fact that here, this particular water is the division between East and West? Because this is a very, very old division. And why do we think of Istanbul as do we imagine that one of the principal aspects of Istanbul is that it lies on this breach in cultural imagination, in geographical cultural imagination? It's very interesting. When I was preparing this, I checked just to be sure Wikipedia on Turkey, not because I don't know what Turkey is, but because I wanted to check a treaty on Turkey. And it occurred to me that it is very interesting that the first line of the English Wikipedia entry for Turkey says that Turkey is a Eurasian country. So avoiding the labeling of Turkey as either a European or an Near Eastern country. Which of course in the case of Turkey has all kinds of contemporary implications. Now, just as a sidestep, Turkey actually is recognized as a European country in the Treaty of Lausanne of 1923, when after the First World War there was a correction to the original peace treaties, and Turkey was granted a European part, and this made Turkey a European nation. So actually there is a definition of it. So, but do we need that? Do we need treaties for that? Turkey, for instance, is the country, Anatolia, where the first in the European, the oldest known in the European language was spoken, Hittite. So, and since in our own identity language is so important, you would think that would be a real crucial argument, but it isn't in the case of Turkey. So what is it? What is it that makes Turkey a country where we hesitate what it is, whether it is European or Oriental? I will come back to this, of course. I also show you this picture to say something about Istanbul as a city. And in the next session of next week, I will come back to this city as one of the greatest achievements of human civilization. And Istanbul as one of the best examples of it, because of its antiquity and because of its nature as metropolis. I often say that Istanbul is the only European metropolis still existent. And what an achievement this is, this city, and what pride man takes in having cities from the first moment onwards. From the first moment that man could write, he has been praising the city. So this is of course also a way of thinking of Istanbul, especially because people have thought of it as a Western city and as an Eastern city, because it has been the capital of the Roman Empire for more than 1,000 years, but also because it has been the capital of the Ottoman Empire for such a long time. So we will come back to this. I mean, I'm now just sort of expanding and showing you what my playfield will be and trying to confuse you as I promised. So, why this divide? Why Orient and Occident? This is the map. I mean, it's not a map that he actually drew, but this is the map that we reconstruct for Herodotus, the Greek historian of the 5th century BCE, who had a certain idea about what he called Asia. He didn't even use the term Europe, but he had an idea about the hinterland of Greece, of the lands to the north and the west of Greece, but not much. I mean, he really had not any idea about Germany, for instance. And he had a vague idea about Asia, but basically about the Levant. And about he had hearsay information about the Persian Empire, but he had really no idea about the real extent of the Persian Empire. And you see in all his information that his perspective on the Persian Empire is very much based on the western half of the Persian Empire. So our Greek sources are always looking at the western half of the Persian Empire. So I just show you this to say that Orient is not a stable thing. It expanded in history, and in the end it came to include even Japan. But for Herodotus, Asia, which corresponds roughly to Orient, was something much smaller. And Europe, by the way, Europe etymologically is just a valley. It's a valley, a name of a Greek valley that came to be expanded to the whole north of Greece and then to the whole of Europe as it was known in antiquity, and then it grew as Europe became part of Mediterranean civilization. So both of them are unstable concepts, and they are, this is very important, they are Greek concepts. They are Greco-Roman concepts. They are not universal concepts. They are not natural concepts that everybody would come up with wherever he is on the planet, as you would do with America and Australia. They are culturally, historically limited concepts that could only arise in those specific circumstances. Look at the Persian Empire, how vast it is, with its center in southwestern Iran. Look at how enormous it is. In the eyes of the Persian kings, the kings of kings, they ruled the entire world, the cosmos. The Persian king of kings was the representative of our Mazda, the chief god of their pantheon. And they didn't think in East and West. They didn't see themselves as the East and Greece as the vast West, not at all. They thought of Greece as periphery, just as they thought of India and Central Asia as periphery. They thought their organization, their spatial imaginary organization, was centered on southwestern Iran, and the further from the center, the more into the periphery, also in the periphery of imagination you would get. And this also coincides with an idea about, for instance, fantastic people. They always live far from the center, exotic people. So the Persians, in a way, also had their Orient, but they didn't call it Orient, and it was not placed in one region. But for instance, about India, they had fantastic stories about man-eating animals, for instance, and birds with a special poison that could kill an entire city. And special snakes and special people and whatever. Of course, the Persians also had their own cultural perception of the other, but it didn't work in the same way as it worked in Greece. And so it is very important to keep in mind that what we call East and West are conceptions that go back to Greek experience. So, I say this because we talk about the Orient and we talk about the Orient and the West today as if it's completely natural to speak about them, as if it's a geographical, as if they are geographically defined and historically defined and perhaps even biologically defined, but they are not. They are not. Now, and since I speak about ideas today, and I speak about also partly about personal impressions, I wanted to show you this. I mean, one of the very interesting things in European imagination about the Orient, especially in the older imagination, in painting and in literature, and also in scientific and pseudo-scientific approaches, the Orient has long been pictured as feminine, as a woman, a passive woman waiting to be colonized by the Europeans. All kinds of feminine aspects are attributed to the Orient, and all kinds of male aspects are given to the West. The West is to dominate because that's biologically, historically, culturally the role of the West. The West, as it were, has the vocation to colonize and to subdue the effeminate Orient, and to organize the effeminate Orient according to the male logic, rational principles of the West. So it's a sublime irony to read one of the most recent results of genetic researches that show that more than 80% of European males descend actually from people that came from the Orient. They were early farmers in the 10th and 9th millennia BC, incredibly long ago, in times that we cannot imagine, thousands and thousands of years even before writing started. And they migrated to Europe, and they were successful because they were farmers. They had techniques, they had a cultural advantage that people in Europe didn't. And the spread of certain genetic traits in their DNA suggests that it is especially males who came into Europe. So it's actually exactly the reverse of this stereotype. It is males from the Orient who come into Europe to civilize Europe. So I'm absolutely not a specialist of DNA research, so please don't ask me how this really works. But I do, as a historian, of course, have an interest in this because it gives a quite powerful counter-image to perceived realities in our cultural perception. So, the other thing that interests me about DNA, and I don't tell this as a joke, although it might seem so, DNA of course has this, for people I imagine who are themselves not in the exact sciences, this almost Kabbalistic quality. It is a sequence of 4 characters that gets infinitely varied and that codes everything, how we behave, how we are, how we look, how old we will be. And there is something very appealing to the fact that we have coded these 4 parts with characters and not with numbers. We could have done that too, and then it would have looked like a digital sequence. But we have chosen to do it with characters, and that makes it almost like a magic formula, a magic name, a secret name of us that, you know, commands us, that writes our destiny. And I say so because this is an idea that is very old, that words and language are determining us and our history. This is a thought that really goes back very, very long and very far. So then we reach, of course, the image that is inevitable in a discussion like this, the Tower of Babel by Peter Bruegel the Elder, from around 1550 or 1560, after Bruegel had visited Rome. So for those who have been there, it's easy to recognize the Colosseum in it, obviously, which was one of the sources of inspiration for this painting. And it is based on the biblical story on the Tower of Babel, which I will read in the King James Version. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech, and they said, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. And the tower was never completed." And this is the really wonderful ancient image of God in the oldest part of Genesis, a jealous God who interferes almost out of personal motives in the lives of man, and who seems to fear this project, this sky-scaling project of building a tower that will reach the sky. So he has to step in. Of course, a very powerful image, and if you now look again at what Bruegel did with it, one of the indications that this project will fill is the fact that in his representation, none of the floors, none of the stories of the building is horizontal. So it looks as if it will collapse already. On the other hand, of course, it is a very powerful image also for Bruegel. It is at least ambivalent. It is also a very beautiful building. It is an impression, an impression that at least leaves you with the thought that the aim in itself was interesting. And this is of course picked up by later artists. I will just show you some examples after this. But and this is much less known. It is also a story that goes back in time. In the book of Genesis, it's not the first version of it. There is an older version, and this is from the 21st century BC, so more than 4,000 years ago. That is longer before Christ than we are after Christ. It's really remarkable that we have literature from those days, but we do. And in this case, the story is that of Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta. It's a Sumerian composition about a king in the south of Mesopotamia, current Iraq, and he is at war or in conflict with a powerful king to the east in the fabled state of Aratta, which might be situated in Iran, but we really don't know. It's a fabulous town. And he demands from the Lord of Aratta construction materials, precious stones to build various temples in his own realm in the south of Mesopotamia. And one of the temples that he's building is in the city of Eridu, one of the oldest cities on earth. And I will show you pictures later. This is a small picture of the site of Eridu as it is now. And there is a sort of strange sidestep in this story where it is told that previously men spoke one language. And I read for you, in those days, there being no snakes, there being no scorpions, there being no hyenas, there being no lions, there being no dogs, a real paradise, or wolves, there being nothing fearful or hair-raising, mankind had no opponents, a paradise situation. In those days, in the countries of Subartu, Hamadzi, bilingual Sumer, and a whole range of other countries, in the whole compass of heaven and earth, the people entrusted to him could address Enlil, the supreme god, verily, but in a single tongue. In those days did Enki, lord of Eridu, that's another god, estrange the tongues in their mouths, as many as were put up there, the tongues of men which were one previously. So in the connection with Eridu, where Enmerkar is building a temple, there is this story of the confusion of the tongues, of languages. And this is, by the time it is recorded, by the way, in say 2100 BC, it is absolutely incredible that cities like that exist. But already by 5000 BC, it was not inhabitable anymore. So they left the city, but the temple was left intact, and it was also rebuilt and rebuilt over the centuries, at least until 2000 BC. And there is archaeologists from Chicago, I believe, have excavated this site, and they found temple after temple, different archaeological layers, and in each of these layers they found fish bones from the offerings to Enki, who is a god associated with the deep waters and to whom one sacrifices fishes. So over thousands of years people have come here in this marsh area and have sacrificed to Lord Enki, even after the city had become completely deserted. Think of that as a cultural image, this deserted city and this big temple that is still functioning. And it had its own temple tower, one of those ziggurats that, for which Mesopotamian civilization is famous. And at some point the ziggurat itself, after 2000 BC, became ruined as well. And so there was this enormous, impressive ruin sitting in that city in the south of Mesopotamia. And there is, of course, a possibility that this particular phenomenon, this image, inspired stories about the vanity of human endeavor, about human building projects, and the vanity about building a tower that wants to reach the sky. Because vanity is something very big in Mesopotamian literature. Apocalyptic visions of the destruction of cities and the end of civilization pervade Mesopotamian literature, and they have the most wonderful images of that. There is, for instance, a composition, it's called 47 Omina, so signs, divine signs, that announced the fall of Akkad. And Akkad was one of the most glorious cities that actually was destroyed by the end of the 3rd millennium BC. And these signs, these Omina, are things like a fox appearing in the western gate, or a deer appearing in a garden in the city, because these are prefigurations of nature coming back into culture. And the demarcation between culture and nature was always a hazardous one. You know, and nature could come back and take over again. And this was a constant fear. So this is one of the images that the Orient gives us, and it's gratifying to see that some of our photographers seem to be aware of this. This is a very beautiful picture of a gazelle in the ruins of Tripoli just after one of the Allied bombardments on that city. And now read one of the texts that I mentioned from the annals of King Ashurbanipal from the 7th century BC. The dust of Susa, one of the cities in Elam that he destroyed, Madaktu, Haltemash, and the rest of their cities, I gathered together and took to Assyria. So even the dust he carries off. In a month of days I ravaged Elam to its farthest border. The noise of the people, the tread of cattle and sheep, the glad shouts of rejoicing, I banished from its fields. It's really apocalyptic. And then wild gazelles and all kinds of beasts of the plain I caused to lie down among them as if at home. And this really is the highest point in this apocalyptic view, that beasts come into the cities and lie down there. So an incredibly powerful image. Why is it important to show images like that? Because these are ancient fears and ancient hopes that have not stopped with the fall of Mesopotamian culture. They have lived on in our collective memory. They are ingrained in our mental DNA. These stories live on. Where man dies, his stories, his words live on. That's why that picture of the Tower of Babel is still so relevant and so important and so powerful. So let's continue on that route. Let me show you another picture of that same building, the Tower of Babel again, now painted by Anselm Kiefer, a famous contemporary German artist. Der fruchtbare Halbmond did he name it this time, in a private collection in Duisburg. And you see that on the one hand he uses the same colors and even the same kind of paint for the background, which really reminds you of the colors that Bruegel uses. But he also uses a slightly different perspective. He stands lower, which perhaps is intended to show more respect for the building, I don't know. But the biggest difference, of course, is that there are no people in this image. So in a way he lifts it from its time frame. He makes it an eternal image. It becomes a symbol. No, it becomes an archetype. He represents this as an archetype. And he has, I think, very consciously not called it Tower of Babel, but fruchtbare Halbmond. So it's not just a ruin, it's not just the sad product of human vanity, but it's also a source. It's also a beginning where stories begin. And this vanity in itself has its quality, because it was an honest attempt by man to reach heaven. And there is something very poetic in that. And the ruins of that are still an impressive building. This is what he takes from Bruegel, that the project itself might have been against God, but it also had an enormous quality. And this pride is certainly in the way he paints this, I think. So this is a counter image, actually. And I want to define, actually, Oriental heritage without borders, for me personally, along these lines. And this is what I'm going to do now and in these next weeks. So let's start at the beginning again, the ancient Near East. Actually, most of the historians that work on this area speak about the ancient Near East rather than the Orient. In yellow, the area of Mesopotamian and ancient Syrian civilization, this in the 3rd millennium BC. And I was just talking about these cities in the south of Mesopotamia, that's here, the land of Sumer. This is where man invented, for instance, just an example, writing. One, apart from the city, of course, one of the most revolutionary developments in human history. And think of it, what it means. Think of that. We are used to think that writing was first used to make economic accounts and lists. And maybe that is true. Maybe that is true. It is true that many of our oldest texts are economic in nature. And it is also true that most of my colleagues who specialize in this oldest period think that there is a slow development towards script. And this slow development starts with simple symbols and it develops into a real script around 3500 BC. But there's also one exception, a colleague of mine named Jean-Jacques Lasner in Paris, who is quite brilliant, I must say. And he has argued against this. He has said that script was not an evolutionary development, but it was a revolutionary development. And that it was invented by one, maybe a few people in one city, the famous city of Uruk, and it was not invented for administrative economic purposes, but to lay down the words of the gods, so that they would not be forgotten, and also so that the gods would not change their opinion all the time. Because, as you know, that is the habits of gods. And man cannot rely on God. He has to make his own way of capturing God. And although most of my colleagues wouldn't agree with that interpretation of Glasner on various grounds, and although there are indeed problems in it, it is at least very captivating in the sense that it does underline how powerful script really is, and it really works also in the sense that maybe not in the oldest phase, but that indeed the words of God were recorded in Mesopotamia, and also the deeds of man were recorded. And one of the things that is really very fascinating is that the first people that started writing, one of the first things that they started to do is make lists of everything, of plants, of stones, of mountains, of gods, of cities, as if they had to catch up and record everything before it was lost. And there is this magical thing that you can do with script, that you can stop time in a way. So I think that Glasner has a point in seeing much more in the development of script than just an economic thing. And as I said, not just the deeds of gods, but also the deeds of men can be recorded in script for eternity. And your version of history can be recorded for history. Your idea, your dream can be eternalized. As here, King Darius the Great has done famously on the rock of Bizertun. And it's in stone. And it's at a place where gods were venerated centuries before Darius. At this sacred place, he recorded his version of history. He made history. This is what you can do with writing. And when you make it in stone at such a holy place, it must be true. It must be true. It's wonderful what you can do with script. Think of that. So, Why Bisutun? Because it's a late text. I could have shown you many other texts. But I will show you this text again next week. Because it is exactly this text, and also the Old Persian version of this text shown here, that was so crucial for the development of Oriental studies. Because it is this text that was first deciphered in the 19th century, in 1847 to be precise, by Lieutenant Henry Rawlinson. And that is a very crucial occasion, a very crucial date, because from that moment onwards, the so-called Orient got its own voice. Ancient documents, some of which I've already shown to you, from those cities of Mesopotamia, suddenly became available to us, became understandable, and no longer was the Orient only seen through the lens of the Bible and the Greek sources, but it had its own voice. And it is a tremendous, tremendous development. So I will come back to that. So we're still speaking about this divide, Orient and the West, Orient and Occident, if you want. And then the division that runs through this great metropolis of Istanbul. Orient. It's of course not only us who have thought about that, but the subject has famously been put on the agenda by Eduard Said in his novel, his essay from 1978, which actually was a reworking of his classes for Columbia University in New York, about the ideas, the history of ideas in Western literature about the Orient, in which he tried to define a kind of common trait in that European imagination of the Orient. What I show you here is the last edition that he himself saw. He died in 2003, and in that same year this last edition appeared with a new introduction, which is also very interesting because of course it's after 9/11, so he could include responses to 9/11, which again show a very Orientalist attitude into this new introduction. It is an enormously influential book, and it has been translated into 36 languages, which by itself already tells you something. It is also enormously hated, and it has been criticized from all sides, and sometimes unjustly and sometimes very justly. There are major problems with this book, but still I reread it when I was preparing for these talks. It is incredibly well written. It is absolutely compelling and captivating. It is absolutely beautiful. It is beautiful. As a personal account, I wish I could write like that. I mean, it's really a gift to be able to write like that, and also to be so well read, and to be able to digest so much literature, so much history of ideas into one coherent essay. And so something I can definitely recommend. So Eduard Said himself, much a child of this divide of Orient and Occident, born as a Christian Arab in Jerusalem, raised in Jerusalem and in Cairo. His father, an American citizen. He moved to America, he got degrees from Harvard and Princeton, and later was mainly based in New York at Columbia University, where he also held these lectures. He wrote on literary criticism, that was his core specialism, but also, for instance, on music. He famously wrote on music, even founded an orchestra, and obviously is very known for his opinions and his essays and his books on the Palestinian question. So Orientalism, enormously influential, and this is also where part of my own history comes into it. I myself, as I said, I specialize in ancient Iran, and the history of ancient Iran, especially of the Persian Empire, has dramatically changed in the early 80s, when a small group of specialists came together and had a number of workshops called the Accumulated History Workshops. They were held in Holland and in England and elsewhere, and they tried to break down the Greek vision on the Persian Empire and give the Persian Empire its own voice. And of course they were tremendously influenced by Eduard Said. They all were completely in love with the book of Eduard Said, and in that sense they were much also scholars of their day and age. They were all born in the 40s or early 50s. They lived through European decolonization, all the changes that Europe underwent in the 60s and early 70s, and when they became academically aware, they had all of this luggage with them already. So they were politically much and ideologically much a coherent group, and they were just 10 or 15, but they decided to change history in the most literal sense, and they did. They really were able to reach a paradigm shift in my subsection of history, completely powerful. And the leader of these people was Helene Sanchisi-Weerdenburg, who was my own supervisor in the Netherlands, and who taught me the history of the ancient Near East, and in particular the Persian Empire. And she unfortunately died quite young when I was writing my dissertation. And this meant that I had to represent her afterwards at various conferences and meetings of this group of Achaemenid history historians. And I remember vividly how weird and powerful the first meeting was. It was in the basement of a hotel in Paris, and I was late, and I came down the stairs, and there I saw all the people that I just knew as names, and basically I was very young, as the names of gods in my field. They were all gathered there, and they turned out to be real people, real individuals, and they welcomed me in a very personal sense. And when I got to know them, I sensed what made them a unified group, what convictions they had in their view on history, and on their drive in correcting this European view on Near Eastern history. Is really incredibly powerful to become part of that. So in a sense, I'm a sort of third generation person in this. So I promised you that I would speak in a personal way about this, so this is the first part of that. Now, what did Said give us? Let's take an example. It is perfectly possible to argue that some distinctive objects are made by the mind, and that these objects, while appearing to exist objectively, have only a fictional reality. A group of people living on a few acres of land will set up boundaries between their land and its immediate surroundings and the territory beyond, which they call the land of the barbarians. It's familiar. In other words, this universal practice of designating in one's mind a familiar space which is ours and an unfamiliar space beyond ours, which is theirs, is a way of making geographical distinctions that can be entirely arbitrary. I use the word arbitrary here because imaginative geography of the our land, barbarian land variety does not require that the barbarians acknowledge the distinction. It is enough for us to set up these boundaries in our minds, our own minds. They become they accordingly, and both their territory and their mentality are designated as different from ours, and to a certain extent modern and primitive societies seem thus to derive a sense of their identities negatively. And so we always need a negative counter-image to define ourselves, and boundaries, of course, are a very good way to start doing that. Now, this small citation shows you, I think, the power of Said, but I can also point out to you one of its limitations. I mean, by his own admission, Said doesn't know all that much about the Near East, about the Orient itself. This is one of the flaws of his book. He was really a historian of literary criticism, of the history of ideas. He was quite familiar with Islamic history, but in general he was not so familiar with Oriental studies. If he had been, his arguments could have been much better, because there are so many great examples from the ancient Near East that would support his arguments. And in the case of these boundaries, I want to give you one of those examples. Again, from an age that we cannot imagine, so old. This is from the 26th century BCE, from the city-state of Girsu Lagash, again in the south of Mesopotamia, where we have a sequence of 9 kings, and they all have left inscriptions and votive reliefs like this, and steles and other inscribed objects. And they're all quite interesting. They all connect the life of the ruler and the benefits that he's giving to the state to his building of temples. His being a good king is expressed by building and repairing temples, but also by defending the city against the evil city beyond its borders. Because in the imagination of the people from Girsu Lagash, they are the better ones, and the evil city of Umar, there are the evildoers. And the conflict that they are describing is really about nothing. Between those two cities there is a large stretch of steppe land where they pasture their herds. And we have to assume that both Umar and Girsu Lagash were using this enormous region between the two cities. Now there was a canal between those two cities, and the canal was accepted, at least on the Girsu side, as the boundary canal. And in their inscriptions, the kings of Girsu repeated time and again that this canal had not been dug by them, but in ancient times, can you imagine, even in the 26th century, people are already talking about ancient times. There had been a king, Mesalim, king of Kish, another city, and he had come in as a neutral arbiter, and he had dug this canal. And he gets almost semi-divine status in this conflict, because he is the authority that they refer back to time and again. Now, during the course of these 9 generations of kings, the succession, there are several incursions from Umar. They cross this boundary canal and they take parts of the land of Girsu, and then they're pushed back again. And every time that it happens, there will be an inscription by one of the Girsu kings. And the interesting thing is that you really see history growing. You know, where the first kings, they react